Good evening, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to Splendid Isolation History number 23, where we're going to look at Britain, the Royal Navy, and the destruction of the slave trade, which was mostly done by Britain and the Royal Navy, as you will discover if you watch this stream. As always, I'm going to start us off with a tune, and I think this is a particularly appropriate one for this stream.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on flooded folk and wall. Your new gods sullen peoples have devil and have child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for the sword, what's love than heed and folly? Bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of those ye humor are slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen people shall weigh your gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come down to search your manhood through all of thankless years. No age with give or wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Take off the white man's burden through all of thankless years.
And that was, of course, the excellent Chris Gard. If you like good music, go and check out his YouTube channel. He's a good dude. I'm happy this evening to have as a special guest Aaron Hook. And this stream was actually Aaron's suggestion. I also just want to say the YouTube channel has finally reached 2,000 subscribers. So there you go.
Congratulations.
Much longer than It took much longer than I would have liked, but and mainly due to our streamers, the people who join as guests, the regulars, and also, of course, occasional guests like Morgoth and what have you. So yeah, we're going to talk this evening about the first major nation in the whole wide world that wanted to stop slavery, which was Britain. Every other country in the world, going right back to the ancient Romans, the ancient Greeks, the ancient Egyptians, etc., slavery was entirely normal. The African nations were entirely in favor of slavery. In fact, the vast majority of slaves that were sold to Europeans were sold by other African nations, as I'm sure Aaron is going to tell us during this stream. It's also worth pointing out that there were never many slaves in Britain, because even under medieval English law, and don't forget, England got rid of feudalism much earlier than anyone on the continent, partly because of the Black Death, but we did get rid of it nonetheless. So there were no serfs in England, let alone slaves. And certainly about the time of the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1776, the British High Court was delivering verdicts saying that the air of Britain was too free for slaves, and therefore you couldn't be a slave in Britain. Britain never had much in the way of slavery in Britain. And, you know, much of the nonsense that you hear from black immigrants in Britain and their apologists is basically bullshit, really. But anyway, I'm no great expert on this subject. This is mostly Aaron's stream, and I'm going to hand it over to Aaron and put up his slides.
Oh, thank you, Duke. Right, so just to give a bit of a basis of what sort of Britain's interaction, the sort of British and particularly English interaction with slavery is, it's from Roman times up until we get to the 19th century. And I say England in particular because the basis for the abolition of slavery in a legal sense comes from common law. And that is an English institution which gets expanded to Wales, Scotland and Ireland during the Acts of Union and sort of English involvement there. So from sort of in pre-Roman times up until the Norman Conquest, slavery, as it is with every society at the time and beforehand, is sort of an accepted fact of life. And that is true regardless of what faith you are. Under Christianity, slavery is regarded as just a normal thing, which is stated in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's a remark in the Old Testament where Christ says, slaves, be loyal, be dutiful to your masters. And so slavery as an institution was sort of utterly socially accepted by everybody. Now, after in the Anglo-Saxon period, the slavery is, as I say, being practiced, and in fact, England is sort of the Anglo-Saxons are known for their involvement in the slave trade, exporting to the continent, particularly through the city of Bristol, which interestingly is, of course, a big place involved in sort of slavery, financially speaking, in the transatlantic slave trade. So that's an interesting, a strange sort of coincidence there of the course of the centuries. And in fact, the exportation of ancient British and Anglo-Saxon slaves to the continent, it causes the Christianity, the sort of Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons, because you can see on screen at the moment is Pope Gregory the Great. And in the 590s, he was walking around Rome with a couple of his priests, and he saw a group of very blonde-haired young boys. And he asked one of the priests who they were, and the priest said that they were Angles from the island of Britain, to which Pope Gregory responded quite famously, and this is from the Venerable Bede, non Angli said angeli, or in English, not angles, but angels. And that sort of prompted him to send the missions under Augustine to Britain, who began first.
We've always been good looking, boys, don't we?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, yeah, and so that oddly enough prompts the Christianization of Britain, which is important because it's very much Christianity that will lead to the moral arguments for the abolition of slavery. So now we fast forward roughly 500 years to the Norman Conquest. William the Conqueror here brings about two things in England during his reign. First, he passes a law that bans the sale of slaves overseas and introduces feudalism to Britain. These two things cause the decline of slavery, I should say, to England, and it causes the decline of slavery in England and in the rest of the British Isles through some English influence. And this comes about because slavery in England wasn't necessarily that profitable, and also the serfs under serfdom in feudalism is preferable to slavery. So, though I will at this point say something about serfdom.
Aaron, can I just ask you something?
Yeah.
David Labaf in the chat says Britain was preceded by Denmark in the abolition of slavery. Now, I know for a fact that obviously he's not talking about Denmark when it was still a Viking type place, because they certainly had slaves. If he's talking about Denmark as a modern European country, I said at the beginning of the stream major European countries. And whilst I'm very fond of Denmark and I've been there, and I like Danish people, I particularly like Danish girls, they're very cute. But I can't say it's a major European country because it isn't. So I think that's the issue there, mate. But yeah, sorry, carry on, Aaron.
That's quite right. Under people sometimes claim serfdom under feudalism was equivalent to slavery. It was not. A serf, whilst they had limitations on them, were free, and importantly, they had property, and they could also sue. And one of the little known fact about medieval England is it was a very litigious society where everybody was able to sue each other, and did quite often. So by 1200, slavery does not exist in England, and it has pretty much died out on the British mainland and is in the process of disappearing completely.
And I think I'm right in saying, Aaron, that even serfdom totally died out in England in the 1300s because of the Black Death.
Yeah, it pretty much it's a lot more gradual. It's not over in the 1300s, but by the time you get to the reign of Henry VIII.
Sorry, I meant the 1300s, like during that century.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. As you actually meant at the start, the Black Death sort of completely upends the system, and by the time you get to the beginning of the Henry VIII's reign, it's completely gone. There are in England, there are bits and pieces in Scotland, Wales, and areas of Ireland, but they themselves are dying out, and eventually they get done with.
There is a reason that people used to speak of freeborn Englishmen, because Englishmen were always freeborn, like after the 1300s, by 1400. So a bit before the Battle of Agincourt, there were no serfs in England. There just weren't any. You were always a freeborn Englishman. You could do as you wished.
Yeah, and just now, when it comes to actual slavery itself in England, when it comes to common law, the first sort of real case we have dealing with it takes place during the reign of Elizabeth I in 1569. It deals with a man called Cartwright, and Cartwright had been a trader with Russia. He had brought back a man who was a slave, and then had been beating this man in the street. Another man who saw this decided this just wasn't right, and that Cartwright shouldn't have been treating this man this way, so he took him to court, and the court found in the man who took the case against Cartwright in his favour. And Duke, you mentioned the quote about the air being too pure. This case, that quote is actually for Cartwright's case in 1569, where the court said the man must be freed and held that England's air is too pure for a slave to breathe in. And so that sets the sort of standard for the idea that you cannot be a slave in England. And now, from that point onwards, up until the middle of the 18th century, the law, there are one or two cases that take place, and they sort of, when they deal with slavery in the colonies. And so there's one case called Butcher's Penny that defines sort of people as property that pretty much applies to Virginia and the American colonies in the West Indies. Within England itself, slaves are, as you say, Duke, very, very, very rare. They're mostly owned by planters and nabobs who come from sometimes a very, very small number from India, but usually from the West Indies, and they are, as you mentioned, Duke, extremely, extremely rare.
Yeah, they're basically like the people who have slaves in England have to keep them very quiet, because if one of these people goes to a court, they're just going to get freed.
Yeah, and now until the second half of pretty much until the sort of 1770s, abolitionism in Britain isn't a particularly big thing. Mainly because there are no slaves, so people don't really think about it. And when they do, they think, okay, that's in Jamaica or that's in Virginia or somewhere like that.
Worth mentioning, Aaron, that in this period, like most English and British people would have gone their whole life and never saw a black or brown person, because there were none of them in Britain.
Yeah, there were the only people who would have seen them, even on occasion, would have people be living in ports where maybe you see one or two in your lifetime. They were that rare.
Yeah. Britain is not a nation of immigrants, as our modern government will try and tell us. It just wasn't. It's a lie.
No, absolutely not. And there is a common claim made by black activists, the idea that there were huge numbers of black people living in England, and that's just utter nonsense.
Yeah, it's bullshit, basically. The only guys, as Aaron correctly said, if you lived in a major port city, yeah, you might have seen one or two black or brown people in your life, but if you didn't, you would have never seen one.
Yeah.
It's just a lie.
Yeah, and in fact, it should be pointed out, most of those wouldn't even have been slaves themselves. They would have been foreign merchants, or if you were in London.
Absolutely, yeah. They wouldn't have been slaves. They would have been seamen on the ships.
Yeah. And now, because of this fact, this sort of complete lack of people there, and particularly the lack of slaves in Britain at all, except in very, very tiny numbers, the abolitionist movement really didn't have anything to go on. And it isn't until sort of the 1770s, 1780s it really takes off. And however, before that, just bear with me a second. Sorry, I had to go off there. There are a small number of abolitionists who are very much committed abolitionists. A notable one is Samuel Johnson, who was throughout his life a strong abolitionist, which put him sort of at odds with a lot of people in society because of that, because of sort of the strength of feeling throughout most of his life. However, there are other ones who are very much committed to trying abolishing slavery and the slave trade in the British Empire, and they are bringing test cases to the courts to sort of essentially get the court to say cases like Cartwright in the past saying that slaves cannot exist in England, and try and try to first of all getting that restated as the precedent, and then using that to expand it to the entire British Empire. And there are a couple of cases that happen. The most famous one is the Somerset case, where a man called James Somerset, who had been a slave in, just wait a second, he'd been a slave in Virginia, come to England, got captured, and was put in irons on a boat in the Thames, and was going to be sent to Jamaica. And a man called Grenville Sharp brought his case to court, and in this judgment, which is called Somerset versus Stuart. Let me just get the dates. I will read you this was decided by Lord Mansfield, the Lord Chief Justice, in 1772. The state of slavery is such of a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reason, moral, or political, or only by positive law, which preserves its force long after reasons, occasions, and time itself, from whence it created, is erased from memory. It is so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law. Whenever inconvenienced is therefore may follow from the decision, I cannot say this case is allowed or approved by English law, and therefore the black must be discharged, i.e. that Somerset was a free man because he was in England, and that restated the Cartwright case's judgment. And this really does sort of sets the ball rolling for the idea of for the abolitionist movement in England. Now, to focus on the abolitionist movement itself, the one thing you have to understand about them is that this is a fundamentally religious movement. They are devout Christians. Beginning in the 1830s, there was a religious awakening called the Great Awakening in Britain and the United States, which causes which is where modern day evangelicalism in Christianity finds its origins, and it's also where Methodism comes from. This is when John Wesley and his brother are very active, and they are reviving Christian morality, which they believe has gone fallow, and they are looking for causes to they want to re-Christianize society, and they regard slavery as a great moral, repugnant moral fact about Christian society. They take the view, and though I'm not a Christian myself, I entirely agree with this. You cannot be a Christian and hold the view that slavery is a good thing. You have to be morally opposed to it. And so through the 1760s, 1780s, and into the 1760s, 1780s, you have the rise of these evangelical movements, many of them within the Anglican Church. These are not necessarily dissenting Protestants, but they're actually Anglicans who are deeply passionate about the subject, starting to support people like Greville Sharp, and they are actively involving themselves in politics to bring about the abolition of slavery.
Aaron, could I ask you something, all right? Because I'm no great expert on this subject. I'm not. This is your stream, basically. But I would just say this. I think from what I've read, and obviously, I was born in 1965, so I can only go on what I've read because this was many, many, many decades after this stuff we're talking about. These Christians, although they were Christians and they didn't like slavery, I don't think they regarded like everyone as equal. They weren't like proto-communists, were they?
Oh no, absolutely not. They very much were not. They did not believe in equality. They believed in equality of the soul, but they were not, for example, necessarily particularly liberal. I mean, my famous advocate for slavery in Britain, and the man who really does bring about the abolition of both the slave trade and slavery in the British Empire, is of course William Wilberforce, who is a deeply conservative figure in every sense of that word. And his evangelical faith very much is imbued by conservative, what would become regarded as conservatism. At the time, he was regarded as a Whig, but these were not people who were liberal in the modern sense at all. These were traditional.
So although they didn't support slavery, they didn't think that, we don't support slavery, but everyone is the same. They didn't think that at all.
No, I mean, you've got to remember these people are very much people who would be very great these are admirers and supporters of Edmund Burke. They are opposed to the French Revolution. And of course, fundamental part of the French Revolution is a sense of equality, which they, other than in a spiritual sense, they do not support at all. Now, probably the most prominent Christian group in the British abolitionist movement in this period is what's called either the Clapham sect or the Clapham Saints. They were Anglicans, and they're a very sort of important group because they have many members in them. Wilberforce is one. You have also just a second. You have Hannah More, who is an evangelical campaigner. She's from a very rich background, and she uses her wealth and her influence in politics to sort of advocate for various causes, various evangelical causes, slavery being one of the most prominent. And of course, you also have I've forgotten his name now. But there was an admiral who. Let me just see if I can find his name. Just bear a second. Oh.
You had, Aaron, during this era, admirals in the Royal Navy who were known as blue lights because they were like highly Christian and were against swearing and all this kind of stuff. And some of them did some good things for the Royal Navy. But because they were generally humanitarian, I guess you'd say. But they were in no way like lefty liberals, like modern lefty. No, not at all.
No. The admiral I'm thinking of is Charles Milton First Lord Barham. He was a member of this, and even though he didn't make he was a career naval officer, and he didn't make his sort of abolitionism something public. He worked within the Royal Navy and with the Admiralty to support the abolition of the slave trade. He died in 1813, so he didn't live to see the abolition of slavery itself in the British Empire. But he very much was involved in influencing the Admiralty when they eventually support the abolition of the slave trade. Now, with the abolition movement, you have both. It is obviously sort of foundationally founded in the evangelical Christian revivalism, but also it comes to prominence at a time when, in the 1770s, 1780s, where Britain is entering an era of reform in terms of political reform, social reform, economic reform. And this begins with the Pitt government, Pitt the Younger's government, which comes into power. I think he becomes power for the first time in 1782 or 1783. And he is very much a reformer. He's a great friend of William Wilberforce. And he, for example, reforms the British government funds and makes the British government solvent again after the American War of Independence. He is very much interested in parliamentary reform, though that has to go on the back burner due to the French Revolution. And he is sympathetic to Catholic emancipation and passes a couple of Catholic emancipation, small emancipatory laws. He gets one passed in Britain and then supports one being passed in Ireland, which at the time had a parliament of his own. He's unable to get Catholic emancipation passed under the Act of Union 801, mainly because George III opposes it on the entirely justifiable grounds that he took the
Aaron, can I ask you on this one?
Yeah.
Right? Because I always think this is interesting. I know quite a few people who I like and I admire on the right these days, who will constantly tell you that, Protestantism and the Church of England and all the rest of it, it's the eternal Anglo, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They'll tell you this, but yet you have people like Pitt the Younger, and you have many others, including, by the way, the Duke of Wellington, who eventually steers it through Parliament, who are entirely in favour of Catholic emancipation in Britain. But it's the eternal Anglo still. Like, what is it that we're doing wrong here? I'm not quite sure,
Well, I think just to go on a slight tangent, with Wellington, it is obviously he grew up in Ireland. He knows the situation with the penal laws, and for him, it's very much a sense of sort of pragmatism that you can reduce the feeling and the difficulties in Ireland if you remove
and also, if I might say so, Aaron, because he was in charge of the biggest British army there was in his era in Portugal and Spain, and also later of Waterloo. And of course, he knew damn well that he had Irish Catholic officers, and he knew damn well that the Royal Navy also had Catholic officers. Not all of them Irish, by the way. They were English Catholics, of course. At one stage on this history stream, I hope to do some stuff about Richard Francis Burton, who ended up marrying into one of the main Catholic families in England. But you know, there were always Catholic officers in the British Armed Forces, and all Wellington was doing was like making that legal.
Yeah.
So they didn't have to hide it. But you will still get, and this is the question I'm asking you, Aaron, is that, you know, on the right, and don't get me wrong, I'm quite fond of a lot of full-on Catholic people on the right, like Dave Green, for example, or Apostolic Majesty, who I think is another one. I absolutely love their content, and I think they're great people. But they do quite often talk, or they don't talk about eternal Anglos, but it's like 1 degree not doing it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's I can only put it down to the fact that at least from the Catholic side, they regard that they haven't ever truly accepted sort of the break with Rome, and on the British side, I think on the sort of the Protestant side, it's a sort of being uncomfortable with sort of the pre-Anglican, sort of pre-Protestant Catholic tradition in Britain, and
yeah, fair enough. It's just, you know, Britain is Britain, and it's different to everywhere else, and some people don't like that, and fuck them, basically. But it is different to everywhere else, and I don't know. I think Britain has gradually like made compacts with the British people, and you know, if you want to be Catholic, okay, be Catholic. That's okay. It wasn't for a long time, but that was partly because you know, there were things going on in Europe which Britain didn't particularly like. So whatever.
Yeah, it's interestingly, in the period that we're going into the 19th century, there is actually within the Anglican Church, you have something called the Oxford Movement, which comes out of that second.
I think it's also difficult to decide who was the most anti-Catholic in, I don't know, circa 1800. Was it Napoleon or was it the British government? I suspect it was really probably Napoleon, but you know, whatever.
Yeah, and also in this period, you have the fact that the British government has been allied with the Austrians, the premier Catholic power in Europe for most of the 18th century. So
absolutely,
yeah, and. Oh, I should say this is Lord Mansfield, and this obviously is Wilberforce. Now, as I say, that the abolition of slavery is in this age of reform. You've got Catholic emancipation, you've got economic reforms, and you've also got social reforms. In terms of this reforming instinct is what produces the Factory Acts in the 1830s, 40s, and various social reform movements, and sort of the reforms.
Aaron, just for people in the chat, is what stopped small children and women working in factories and lines and stuff like that. Yeah.
And of course, you've got the parliamentary reform, so reforming the electoral system for electing parliament in 1832, 1867, 1884. And so this is something that pretty much begins in that period with Pitt's first government arriving into power in, I think it's 1783 up until pretty much the end of the 19th century. And so when you look at what's going on with the abolition of slavery in Britain, you have to always remember that it is very much a product of this general age of reform and this religious revival. So Wilberforce is advocating in Parliament for the abolition of slavery from I think he's elected as the MP for Hull, which had actually under the old unreformed Parliament.
Yeah, it was Hull. I've been there, mate, and there's a big statue of him in Hull.
Yeah. Interestingly, Hull at the time, given the unreformed nature of Parliament, had the sort of widest franchise of any parliamentary seat. So I can't remember the exact number, but it was, I think, almost the majority of the adults living in Hull constituency could actually vote, which was very unusual at the time.
And so it was also Hull was also a city which was mostly in those days the money in the city, or the town, came from fishermen.
Yes,
it was mostly a fishing town. And many of them were individual guys who owned their own fishing boat and would take their relatives and friends to sea to go and try their luck. Very dangerous, by the way. It was like fishing in the era of sail was even more dangerous than it is today. So you had to be a pretty tough dude to go and do it. But most of these whole fishing boats were like owned by an individual who said, yeah, all right. And he'd take his sons and maybe his cousins and what have you to sea with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the sort of constituency that Wilberforce is representing in Parliament, and he is being supported by, and Hull very much was a city that supported the abolition of slavery. There were areas in the country that didn't. These were usually cities that had involvement with the slave trade itself. So Bristol and Liverpool were notable ones. In fact, in the mid 1770s, Edmund Burke had been the MP for Bristol, and he famously got voted out because he gave that very famous defence of the autonomy of an MP from his constituents, i.e. that an MP does not necessarily have the MP owes his honesty of his opinions to his constituents, not his autonomy to them, i.e. that the MP does not have to always agree with the constituents, which is a reasonable point. But given that the reason why he made this speech was he was critical of slavery in a city that owed a considerable amount of vote to slavery, was not so say the most pragmatic thing to do.
And do you know what? Part of the thing about being an MP is if people don't like you, then at the next election they can sling you out, and they should do that.
Yeah. And so Wilberforce is making a series of attempts from the 1780s onwards to bring in a bill to abolish the slave trade. He very much sees the abolition, that the idea that you abolish the slavery as a whole within the British Empire, you can't do that in one go. You've got to do it in two parts. So first get into the international slave trade, Britain's involvement, and then abolish slavery in the empire itself. These are sort of.
Could I just say one thing, Aaron?
Yeah.
Certainly by the late 1780s or 90s, very few British ships were involved in the slave trade. It wasn't what most British ships were doing. Most British ships were taking goods from one place to another. The slave trade, and as we have said in this stream from the start, was never as big in Britain as people think it was, or as certain immigrants claim it was. There weren't that many British ships involved in the slave trade in the 1780s and 90s, it was quite uncommon. Sorry, Aaron.
Actually, I can add something to that. Despite what you would hear from certain people, even the amount number of slaves that went to British colonies in the West Indies and North America was comparatively small. 40% of all the slaves that were transported across in the transatlantic slave trade went to Brazil.
Yeah.
And I think it was only
Portuguese Brazil.
Yeah, and then I think the next biggest one were the Spanish colonies, and also,
Yes.
and so the British colonial involvement in the slave trade was nowhere near as big as it's sometimes claimed. You have these ideas sometimes from these people that Britain was the only person involved in this, and also this usually comes from some Americans who seem to think this because of their own country's involvement in slavery within its country. There's usually the sort of idiots who think the slavery only took place in the United States, which is ridiculous. And
yeah, absolutely, man. Yeah, I totally agree with that. But obviously, if you watch like the Bias Brainwashing Corporation these days, you will never see this.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's also deeply irritating because you will also hear from people who will claim falsely, and this has been going on since the 1990s, of certain black academics claiming that Wilberforce wasn't doing what he was doing out of his obvious moral objection to slavery, but because he was somehow being bribed to by West Indian interests, which makes no sense when you think about it. It's just it's just ridiculous. Now, obviously, Wilberforce, as I say, started introducing bills to abolish the slave trade in the late 1780s into the 1790s. Pitt the Younger is sympathetic to this, but understandably, given he's having to deal with the immediate aftermath of the French Revolution, and then the French Revolutionary Wars, and then the start of the Napoleonic Wars, he's not got much time to involve himself in it officially. And Wilberforce's sort of attempts to bring about the abolition of the slave trade are unsuccessful until 1806. What happens there is that you have a maritime lawyer called James Stevens suggests a way to sort of abolish the slave trade by the back door, which is to pass a law that bans British subjects from trading slaves with the French and French allies. This is reasonably successful and then gets passed as the Foreign Slave Act in May 1806. At the same time, there's been a change in government. Pitt's out of office and then dies, and there is what is called the Ministry of All the Talents, where sort of a cross-party coalition comes into power, and a man called Lord Charles Grey gets appointed as the First Lord of the Admiralty. Now, Grey is a supporter of Wilberforce, though he himself is a Whig. Wilberforce, as I say, was very much...
Aaron, he has his faults as a First Lord of the Admiralty. He really does. He does a lot of bad stuff for the Royal Navy. But we'll leave that aside and go on to the slavery.
So in this period, Grey is a supporter of the abolition of the slave trade, and so is Lord Grenville, the Prime Minister, who's appearing at the House of Lords. And so they, together with Wilberforce, get the abolition of the slave trade passed in February 1807, short of only a few days before the government itself collapses, because this government is very unstable. One of the leading forces in it is Charles James Fox, and he dies during the course of it. And he's
an evil. Charles James Fox was an evil bastard, and really a Jacobin, in my opinion.
Yes, he was. Fox was Edmund Burke's great opponent, and I should say at this point, I am biased in Burke's favour, as he's one of the heroes, but Burke was right. Full stop. Now, so this So the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act is passed in 1807, and this leads to the establishment of the it's called the West African Squadron, isn't it? The Royal Navy's.
Yes, initially, yes.
Yeah, and so this is established to go after the slave trade, and it continues, I believe, into the 1860s. If I'm right.
Yes. And Britain continues its anti-slavery patrols in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Arabia into the 1920s. But yeah.
And so now these are ships then stationed off the West African coast. And now, one thing I will mention at this point, I should have mentioned earlier, that whilst Wilberforce's and the collaborative sect and all the abolitionists are advocating for the passage of the abolition of slavery, the slave trade, they are also involved in the establishment of Sierra Leone, which is a colony in West Africa, which is now a country where ex-slaves will be taken to settle. And also, I should mention this earlier as well, sorry about this. During the American War of Independence, there were various sort of proclamations made by British commanders who said to the slaves of American revolutionaries that if you serve in the British Army, you will become a free man. And many of them do. And when the war ends, they end up being taken to Canada. In fact, there's a very famous exchange between George Washington and I forget the name of the British commander in New York, who George Washington demands all the sort of fugitive slaves who are in British forces be handed over, and the British commander, I think it's Henry Carleton, his name. He says, he says, I can't do that because that would be breaking my word, and as an Englishman, I will not break my word. And so all the free slaves and fugitive slaves who are with British forces essentially get taken out of the 13 colonies, what become the United States, and many of them settle in Canada. And many of them then get recruited by the abolitionists to go and settle in Sierra Leone with the slaves who eventually get sent there.
Yeah, this is a little bit that I know something about. That in the War of 1812, which actually went from 1812 to 1814, if an American slave could get himself on board a Royal Navy warship, he was no longer a slave. Would not be returned to his former owners, and as Aaron is correctly saying, would instead be landed in Sierra Leone, which was a British colony with a British government. There was a governor and all the rest of it. And he would be landed back in Africa, basically. And it's interesting, and we should probably talk about this a bit, Aaron, that, the Americans at about the same sort of time set up Liberia, but the Americans were never willing to actually run Liberia. And so what happened in Liberia is the freed American slaves who were sent over there, they immediately enslaved all the local Africans.
Yeah.
Amazingly enough, they did. Black Lives Matter, but not only if you're not African, but whatever. But whereas Sierra Leone, which was set up with the Brits, had a British colonial governor, and the Africans who were sent there were absolutely just freed, and go and do what you want, guys.
Yeah. And when it comes to Liberia, obviously given where most of the slave states were, a lot of the slaves who would get resettled in Liberia were from the south. And of course, not only do they, as you said, they would be starting enslaving the local Africans, they recreate essentially the southern planter society with themselves as planters in Liberia, and they essentially remain in that way, though slavery is abolished in the 20th century until there's a coup in Liberia in I think late 19th century, early 1980s.
There's been so many coups in Liberia, mate. But yeah, there's been more coups than you can count in Liberia. But yeah, all right. But yeah, I mean, American foreign policy, whatever. I think we should talk a bit about when the Royal Navy had this West Africa squadron, which was specifically set up to stop the slave trade. And it didn't only, I mean, there were almost no British slave ships at this stage. By 1807, there were none, really. But there were some American ships, there were Brazilian ships, there were Spanish ships, Portuguese ships, etc. But these guys, they actually lost quite a lot of men, partly from tropical diseases, because they often operated in tropical rivers and this sort of thing. But also, they used to fight the slavers, and the slavers had cannon and muskets and what have you. And so Britain was actually spending quite a lot of blood and treasure to stop the slave trade.
Oh yeah, I can't remember what it was, but it was one of the most expensive campaigns the British ever, in peacetime, ever committed to.
And of course, Aaron, we started this in 1807 in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah.
So it wasn't even in peacetime.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, it cost both blood and treasure. I think, I'm not sure, did the West Africa squadron have a higher rate of death when it came to tropical diseases in the West Indies?
I would have probably not higher, because being on a ship is a little bit more helpful. But it would have been the second highest after that, for sure.
Yeah, and one thing I should mention at this point is the fact that a lot of the African tribes were not at all pleased by the British action of abolishing the slave trade. In the run-up to the passing of the Act and reviews afterwards, there are letters being sent to London from various African kings opposing the abolition of the slave trade by Britain and asking it to be reversed because it was costing them. They were losing a huge amount of money, and the British government just refused them. But so you had the Royal Navy West Africa Squadron obviously fighting these slave traders, and also having to deal with the African kingdoms, who in many cases were protecting the slave trade, the slavers fought at the coasts. And so this sort of means that the British are fighting an undeclared war in West Africa for the better part of 60 years.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The Royal Navy and the Royal Marines, they were capturing these African like slave fortresses and what have you, and it was the African kingdoms like the Ashanti, etc., who were mostly selling slaves to the Americans, the Brazilians, the Portuguese, and the Spanish. It was Africans who were selling these people to them, and they were mostly prisoners of war, or families they'd captured when they captured their village, this kind of stuff. This was absolutely what was going on. And as you rightly say, Aaron, the African kings were complaining because they liked the slave trade. It was their slave trade, basically.
Yeah, and at this point, I think I should just mention the American...
Aaron, your sound ain't great, mate. I don't know what's going on, but Yeah.
I think it's from the US Navy.
Your sound is not good, Aaron. I'm sorry. I don't mean to, but I can barely hear you. Is what I'm trying to say.
Is that better?
A little, but not much. There's a lot of background noise, Aaron. I don't know what it is. If you don't have a lot of noise going on in your actual where you are, yeah, it might be better not using the headphones, but I don't know.
Okay, we'll just see.
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, that's
that
better,
better?
Aaron.
Or-
Yeah, it is. It's
okay.
much better. Yeah, it's much better.
Okay, well, I should just say at this point, I think we should just reference the US Navy East Africa Squadron, which is set up at the same time, mainly because it spends most of its time not actually going after the slave traders, but more interfering with British the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron.
Trying to.
Yeah, and the reason for this is very simple. When the Americans abolished their involvement in the slave trade in 1808. This comes about because of an agreement in the US Constitution over the issue of slavery in the American Constitutional Convention, I think, came back in 1789 or something like that. And so they are removed from the international slave trade, and they decide to set up a West Africa Squadron following the British. However, because obviously you've got the significant power of the slave states in the south, they are not exactly happy about being involved in the suppression of the slave trade, not because they are necessarily opposed to the idea of not being involved in the international slave trade, because actually that makes slavery in the United States more profitable, but because they don't like the idea of supporting abolitionism, which is obviously what the British are pretty much campaigning to do. Because World War IV's campaign continues up until the 1830s, and so they use the US Navy's West Africa Squadron mostly to make sure that American flag ships don't get boarded by Royal Navy ships. And
doesn't always work though.
No,
but yeah.
And so throughout this period, so pretty much from roughly 1810 up until the American Civil War, you have the Royal Navy dealing with the slave traders, dealing with the African kingdoms, and occasionally having to put up with the US Navy's West Africa Squadron poking their nose in. And so these things are all going on. Now, between the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the abolition of slavery within the British Empire, two things are happening. The first is in Britain. The government of Lord Liverpool, who becomes Prime Minister in 1812, is very much committed to prosecuting the abolition of the slave trade internationally. So they use various diplomatic pressures to force the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the various European powers to sign up to various treaties to abolish the international slave trade. These European nations, shall we say, sometimes backslide. So the Spanish are notable for this because they continue to participate in the international slave trade even after they signed an agreement with Britain not to do so. And also, you have in the New World, Brazil becomes independent from Portugal in the 1820s, and they are actively involved in the international slave trade. And so, because of this, the Royal Navy, when dealing with, say, the Portuguese, are very proactive. They do not merely just go after the Portuguese slave trading ships when they're at sea. They will go into Brazilian slave trading ships when they're at sea. They will go into Brazilian ports and attack these ships, as well as being more than willing to go after to fight off Brazilian naval ships that might try and interfere with them. And there are numerous occasions where the Royal Navy will go into a Portuguese harbour, and either they will board the slave ship or they will they will fire shots at it, not to sink it, but to get it to surrender, and then they will take it back out to sea and board it. And the Brazilian government complains about this, but there's nothing they can do. The Brazilian Navy is not the Royal Navy, and so the British are able to use their undisputed naval supremacy to prosecute this, the abolition of the international slave trade, with real force, and that's why.
Yeah.
In the 19th century,
there's also something else that is worth mentioning, is that when a Royal Navy ship stopped a slave ship, everyone on that ship, from the captain down to the cabin boys, they got head money. So for every slave that they saved and took back to Sierra Leone in West Africa, the Royal Navy officers and men, they made money on that. They were given like a prize for taking those guys back and girls. And so, the Royal Navy was very keen to do this. You could like triple your wages for a month or something if you captured a slave ship.
Yeah, and as I say, the Liverpool government is very supportive of this, particularly the Foreign Office under George Canning, who's an ardent abolitionist himself, and he is using the Royal Navy as a hammer to force the other nations to essentially give up and support the abolition of the international slave trade. Now, Wilberforce has been continuing to campaign throughout this period, and the late 1820s is when sort of the age of reform really kickstarts and becomes full-throated. So you have the emancipation of the Catholics in 1828, you have the formation of the Metropolitan Police Force, and then the following year you have the reform of the Bloody Code, which was a sort of legal code in Britain, which had been around in England and in Britain, which had been around since the 1660s, but which was very which you could get executed for, I think, only a certain penny's worth of.
You weren't very often, to be fair.
No,
but you could be. Yeah, you could.
It's a very, very brutal legal system that made sense in the Restoration period, but by the 1820s, sort of seemed odd and strange and needed to be reformed. And Sir Robert Peel was the one who oversaw the reforming of that, and then of course parliamentary reform is coming about at this point, so 1832, and then after the passage of the 1832 Reform Act, you have, in 1831 you have a general election where the Whigs come into power under Charles Grey, Earl Grey, the man who had been First Lord of the Admiralty and had helped Wilberforce pass the Abolition of Slavery Bill in 1807. He becomes Prime Minister, passes the Great Reform Act, there's another general election, gives the Whigs a majority, and in 1833 they introduce the Abolition of Slavery Bill, which becomes the Abolition of Slavery Act in 1833, which abolishes slavery in the British Empire. And Wilberforce
in the whole British Empire, which is to say about a third of the world at that stage.
Yeah. And Wilberforce dies in 1833, but he lived just long enough to receive a message to say that the bill had passed the House of Commons for the last time, and it was going to receive royal assent. So he lived to see the ultimate achievement of his life become a reality. And so he in fact he's in his bed dying when this happens, and so he goes to his God, having actually done what he believed was the right thing, and seen it passed by when he's seen it done, which is a thing that I think very rarely happens, but in his case it was something that really did happen.
Fair enough. Yep, fair enough. And as we are saying, this was the abolition of slavery throughout the whole British Empire, which was about a third of the world in those days. And the British taxpayer ended up paying for this because we paid compensation to slave owners. And I think we only eventually ended up paying for it in the 20th century, I believe.
Yes,
it was so expensive.
Yeah, it was. I think. Actually, I think it might have been even later than that. I seem to remember when we had the sort of the bicentenary of the passage of the Slave Trade Act in 2007. I don't think I'm not sure it's been paid off then. I think it was.
Listen, Aaron, you probably know more than me, but I thought we eventually paid that under Thatcher, but like in the 80s or 90s, it was a long time after 1833. But at this stage, the slavery is like illegal in the whole British Empire, third of the world back then. And of course, if you look at Africa in the, I don't know, say the early 1960s, when it was still basically run by Europeans mostly, slavery had almost completely died out in Africa. If you look at Africa in 2025, post-colonial Africa, slavery's becoming more and more common because Africans have always supported slavery, except when they're in European countries.
Yeah. And actually one thing we should mention is the fact that that Britain's sort of colonies in West Africa develop really sort of take off in the 1860s and 70s. The sort of British involvement there begins because of the West African squadron, and then the British start moving their anti-slavery operations inland, and so you wouldn't have had.
And also, Aaron, they don't only move them inland, but they move them to the Gulf of Arabia and the Red Sea, where they're still very common. And Britain was running anti-slavery patrols in that area up until the 1920s, at least.
Yeah, and I remember reading once. There was an interview done by the actor John Rhys Davies, who people probably know for playing Gimli in Lord of the Rings. Well, his father was a colonial official in Kenya in the 1940s to the 1960s, and John Rhys Davies tells the story of his father taking him down to the docks, and there's this boat with a group of Arabs on and a group of sort of black boys, and John Rhys Davies asked his father what they were, and his father said quite angrily, "Those boys are slaves, and I cannot do anything about it because of the UN."
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. Absolutely does make sense. But yeah, I mean, look, if you take anything away from this stream, people who are watching it is that Britain was the first major nation in the world to say, the slave trade is not a good thing, slavery is not a good thing. And we were the first people to abolish it. But if you are a modern young British guy, as I'm sure Aaron will say is true, we are constantly told, "Oh no, Britain was the worst slaving nation." No, absolute opposite to that. Slavery was never legal in Britain, really, and Britain was the first major nation to go against it. But you will never see any immigrant group in Britain admit that. You'll never see it, and you will never see two-tier Keir Starmer admit that, of course not. And you'll never see that most British people prior to about 1965 or 70 never saw a black or brown person. You'll never see anyone tell you the truth of these things, but it is the truth.
Yeah, and there's also an interesting thing that if you look at that, if you say look at the African leaders who criticise for our involvement in the slave trade, especially in West Africa, what you will notice is that they come from the ethnic or tribal groups that were involved in the slave trade.
Yep. Yeah.
And the sheer hypocrisy of the people. They were the people involved in the slave trade who opposed it when we abolished it, and then we had to fight to force them to accept the abolition of slavery.
People like the Ashanti, for example, were the guys who used to capture prisoners of war, which of course included women and children, and then they would sell them to Portuguese, Brazilian, and Spanish slavers. And it was those guys the Royal Navy was stopping. And many, many Royal Navy sailors and also Royal Marines died from either tropical diseases or actually fighting the slavers. Britain paid a really high price in both blood and treasure to stop the slave trade. No other nation in the world did. Britain did.
Yeah.
Because Britain's kind of a special nation. We always have been, we always will be, and we ain't dead yet.
Yeah. And in fact, one thing there's an academic called Bruce Gilley. He's an American academic, but he's very much somebody who supports sort of British history. The police British Empire was force for good. Some people watching this might know him because he published an article in 2017 called "The Case for Colonialism," where he not only defended colonialism but said it should probably be brought back. That caused a big sort of controversy, and he did a lecture sort of defending colonialism, and particularly defending the British Empire in Africa. And he brought up an interview that was done in the late 1940s with an elderly woman in, I think, northern Nigeria. And she was being asked by this British academic about her sort of interaction with the British Empire. And she was entirely positive about it. And it became very clear the reason why she was entirely positive about it was that when the British arrived in the area she had been born in and living in, the area was being governed by the Fulani, and she was a slave. When the British turned up, she was freed. She got gainful employment and had a better life. And as far as she was concerned, the British were the saviours, and the African tribes who had enslaved them were evil. And that was that was absolutely a common belief by people.
100%, mate. Yeah. Aaron, would you like to plug your channel?
Yes, my channel is Aaron James Hook. I cover mostly book reviews, but also do film stuff. I've recently been doing a series of live streams with a couple of indie authors about our favourite films in various film genres, and also myself and Duke this coming Sunday, 10 p.m. British time, are going to be doing a live stream on our top 5 favourite British and Commonwealth war films, which will be war films that cover pretty much any conflict that Britain and the Commonwealth are involved in and are made by British and Commonwealth filmmakers.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that, Aaron. I would also say to people, Aaron Hook, the reason he's Aaron Hook is he's actually Henry Hook's descendant, the Victoria Cross guy from the Battle of Rorke's Drift on the 22nd, 23rd of January, 1879. Aaron is actually one of his descendants. So, yeah, Aaron's a good guy. But yeah, thanks, guys. Britain was more involved in getting rid of the slave trade than making it. And that should be fairly obvious to everyone who watched this stream, I hope. Of course, the immigrants in Britain today, they want to pretend it's the opposite. But what a surprise. And all of those guys need to be deported, as far as I'm concerned. That's what I think, anyway. I'm also happy to say our channel has got up to 2,000 subscribers. Please do subscribe, guys. It helps. Liking the stream and subscribing to the channel really helps it a lot. Let me have a quick look that we didn't get any super chats. We did not. I do think Garen, by the way, gave us $3 last week, which I might have missed. So I'm sorry for that. But yeah. Britain spent a lot of blood in terms of sailors and Royal Marines dying, and a lot of treasure in terms of money in stopping the slave trade. And in 1833, Britain made slavery illegal through the whole of the British Empire, which was a third of the world at the time. So you can call us eternal Anglos or whatever bollocks you want to call us, but I think you're not being very realistic, guys, if you do that. I think Britain was always the place of brave free men. And I don't think it ever changed, really. But, I am biased, of course I am. Thank you, Aaron, for the stream. I'll put Aaron's links in the description. And we will be back on Saturday for our normal political current affairs stream, what we normally do. I'm going to try and play us out. Let's see if I can do it. There we go. May work. Okay.
Now I am St. George, I'm a champion bold, and over old England my flag I'll unfold. My sword fights for justice with truth for my shield, and when I come riding I never shall yield. And on my breast a red, red rose, the flower of old England wherever she grows. I fought with the dragon and brought it to shame. I was killed 7 times, but I still fought again. I was killed 7 times, but it did me no ill. If the battle be true, then I'll fight again still. And on my breast a red, red rose, the flower of old England wherever she grows. In the cause of all freedom my banner shall wave. The oppressed and downtrodden my sword it shall save. In the righting of wrongs I never shall tire. That the weak become strong is all my desire. And on my breast a red, red rose, the flower of old England wherever she goes. I'll watch o'er your horses, your house and your land, and if you have none, still your friend I will stand. I'll strengthen your courage for all you hold dear, to vanquish all doubt and banish all fear. And on my breast a red, red rose, the flower of old England wherever she goes. Now be sure in your heart if you call on my name, for I fight with the fury of fire and flame. Any lies or deceit to a cinder I'll burn, and once you invoke me I never shall turn. And on my breast a red, red rose, the flower of old England wherever she goes. For I have power to pierce to the heart. I strike like the lightning, I can tear you apart. On hoofbeats of thunder over England I'll ride. What foe can defy you with me by your side? And on my breast a red, red rose, the flower of old England wherever she goes.
That was from Patriotic Archive, who is a good friend of the channel, and go and check him out on YouTube. Thank you to my friend Aaron Hook for his eloquence this evening. And I'll just say, for England and St. George. We'll check you later, boys.
Bye.
Thanks, Aaron. That was most interesting.
Well, we're still live, Duke.